Welcome to Creative Piecemeal Podcast, a podcast for creatives. I'm your host, Tammy Takeishi. Join me for compelling conversations with artists, actors, authors, musicians, and other creatives about the impact of the creative and fine arts in their lives and our ever-changing world. Thank you for listening. Welcome to Creative Piecemeal, a creative arts podcast. I'm your host, board-certified music therapist, Tammy Takeishi. Each show features a different artist from the field of fine and creative arts, and I'm delighted to bring American violinist Tracy Silverman to the show today. Tracy Silverman is a musical force. He made his debut with the Chicago Symphony at age 13 and kept pursuing his dreams. He was a founding member of the Turtle Island String Quartet and has since released dozens of records and gone on to compose and tour extensively. Currently, he serves on the faculty at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. Tracy, welcome to Creative Piecemeal. I am so excited to reconnect with you and have you on the show.
Likewise, Tammy. It's great to see you.
Thank you. We're going to get started with what inspired you to get into music and pick up the violin?
The big questions. Well, I think I was so young that I barely remember. It seemed like I've always been a musician. It was never really a choice. It was just sort of something that I always did, and it sort of just seemed obvious that that's what I was going to do, But I do remember as a very young kid being really just affected by music. And I think this is, obviously my parents noticed that and nurtured that. And I have to say, I am, extremely lucky. I'm very grateful that my parents were so supportive and aware of this. But I, must acknowledge my privilege and the advantages that I had with parents who saw that but could do something about it. Both my parents were teachers. We didn't have a lot of money, but we had enough for violin lessons from the guy who lived down the street and stuff like that. And my parents were so supportive that they would drive me hours to the best teachers that they could find, and devoted a lot of their time and energy and money to giving me the best musical education that I could get from the time I was quite young. They always sought out the best teachers, and by the time I was 8, I was already at Juilliard pre-college because they thought that was the best. We were about an hour away from the city in New York at that point, and then a couple years later, when I was 10, we moved to Beloit, Wisconsin, where my dad got a job at the college, and there wasn't a great teacher in Beloit, so we would drive 2 hours every Saturday to Chicago, to Chicago Musical College, where I studied with Morris Gomberg and then Deborah Wood, who was later Deborah Schwartz, who are just the most remarkable, amazing teachers, and where I really learned almost everything that I know about string playing. But that was at the age of 10 through 15, and my dad would make this 2-hour trip there, sit for an hour at the lesson, where he was deputized by my teacher to, while I was home, to watch how I was practicing, because he sat there and knew everything that he learned. He was learning everything that I was learning, and then drove 2 hours back home, and we did that for years and years. So very grateful for all that. But I'll tell you what happened when I was about 4 years old, and how I think that they started to discover that this was, kind of what I was interested in. I was on my trike and riding down we lived on this little block, and down at the end of my street, there was a young man, Ronald Carbone, who is still around and is still a working musician in the New York area. And he lived down at the end of the street. He was probably, I don't know, in his early 20s at that point. And he was a very good violinist. And I think he was a concert master in an orchestra, and like a local orchestra. And I heard this music. I was pedaled down a little further than I was supposed to go, because he was down at the end of the block and I was only 4. But there was no traffic back then. And I'm pedaling down there and I hear this wonderful music coming from this house. And it sounded like, It's early in the morning. I can't sing a thing. You know, the Scheherazade melody. I could play it on violin. I can't sing at 10 a.m. And so I was just like, what? Who is this lady singing? I just thought it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. And I quick turned around on my trike and I rode home as fast as I could. And I got my older brother, who's 2 years older than me, Brian, and you know, he knew everything. So I said, Brian, you got to check this out. There's some lady down at the end of our street who's singing. I didn't do that. I went, and he said, what are you talking about? There's no lady down there. So he gets on his bike and we ride down there. And sure enough, there it is, this beautiful sound. And he turns to me and he says, wow, you don't know much about music, do you? He goes, that's not a lady singing. That's somebody playing the flute. So that night, I'm telling my parents, I was like, I heard this amazing flute player down at the end of the street. And it was like, oh, I want to be able to play the flute. I want to do that. You know, and they're like, what are you talking about? They figured it out and they started giving me violin lessons with Ronnie Carbone. And that's how I started. And, you know, I remember around that same time listening to, my dad had classical records. He had a hi-fi system back in the 60s. This is around 1964, 65. You know, he had a hi-fi set and had some LPs and had a recording of the Sibelius Violin Concerto. And somehow I found it, heard him playing it or whatever, and just fell in love. I mean, I had never heard, you know, that passage where it goes up to the sixth, the famous, you know, and it just tears your heart out. To this day, it brings tears to my eyes. Well, it brought tears to my eyes as a little 4 or 5 year old kid. It was like an emotional wallop that I just, you know, it was like, you know, musical heroin in my veins, you know, and I didn't know how to react, and I would just like cry, and my parents saw this and like, wow, you know, this, you know, this is making an impact. And I just fell in love with the violin music, the Prokofiev violin concertos. I played the Milstein recording of that till, I swear, the, you know, grooves must have gotten so worn you could see through the record. I used to listen to it every night. Fell in love with that music. And so that was my beginning. You know, I really fell in love with classical music, but my dad also played a lot of jazz. So I was brought up listening to a lot of that. My mom was a big musical theater fan, so we had that. And I had an older brother. So by the time I was in my early teens, he was listening to a lot of rock and roll. He was turning me on to Hendrix and Zappa and Jean-Luc Ponty, who I'd never heard of before. He's like, for my 16th birthday, my brother bought me a birthday present that was possibly the most influential thing that ever happened in my musical life. He got me 3 records: Jimi Hendrix, Cry of Love, Frank Zappa, Hot Rats, and Jean-Luc Ponty, Enigmatic Ocean. And that just kind of, he said, because I've been playing classical music for years at this point, he said, you need to listen to this. And it really changed my outlook. And I had been listening to a lot of rock and roll anyway, but I really studied these records, and it really changed my direction.
I can imagine. And it sounds like your whole family, everyone's got such broad and wonderful musical tastes, and you're, you know, willing to just give anything a try, give anything a listen, and let that music affect you. And that is a wonderful origin story of how you came to be Tracy Silverman, the violinist. It's basically like fate then, you and the violin.
I guess, you know, or just the first thing I came across, you know. But yeah, it was so, just more emotional to me than piano, I guess. You know, it just had more of that, you know, had more soul. And what I realized as I went through my musical life, you know, in retrospect, you know, hindsight is 2020. I look back and I see that all of the things that I gravitated towards, all the kinds of music that I was loving as a kid, all had a common thread, and that's they were all incredibly soulful. It was all stuff that was very emotional. Aretha. I mean, I just, at some, you know, at one point, and Ray Charles, I just could not get enough. You know, there was something about that cry in the voice. And I think, maybe I always have thought that part of my Jewish heritage, has a sort of the cantorial, that cry in the voice that you hear a lot in a lot of, cultural music from Eastern Europe. Um, and I don't know if that's, part of that sort of cultural thing that I heard from grandparents and parents, but I was always attracted to music that was really packed an emotional wallop, and that's what I gravitate towards when I compose and play.
Understandable. Yeah. Music is so powerful, and there's just certain artists and composers that, people get really drawn to. So it definitely sounds like, violin is the right choice for you. But if you ever had to pick another instrument to play, what do you think it would be?
Probably piano, actually. I, didn't mean to like slag piano, but the one regret of the regrets that I have in life is perhaps my biggest musical regret is that I didn't really learn piano well enough. I took piano lessons a little bit as a minor in college. You had to have some piano, but I was never fluent. I could never read, sit down and play the piano the way I wanted to. And now I play, I can play a little bit of jazz and rock and stuff like that, but I just don't have it in my fingers the way I do with the violin. And I wish I did, because as a composer, there's no instrument really more useful than the piano.
It is definitely very versatile in composing. Can you tell me a little bit more about your current composition projects and I guess where you find your inspiration for those?
Yeah, well, I usually have like a list of projects that are on my whiteboard over here that I haven't gotten to yet. So it's not so much a matter of inspiration, I think, as much of just trying to get to the things that I want to do. It's sort of like a laundry list or a shopping list of stuff that I'm hoping to buy, a wish list. That's what it is, and I just try to get to them one at a time. And as a professional, there's always a lot of other considerations that go into what projects you're going to do next. And often most projects are collaborative in some way. So it's a matter of who do I want to work with, who is available right now for me to do these projects. So there's all kinds of logistics and business considerations that are involved in what projects get done and what's next. But from a more creative standpoint, which is I think what you're asking, the inspiration, one of the last big projects that I did was my third electric violin concerto, which is called Love Song to the Sun. And all of these concertos, although they've been commissioned and, was paid to write them, which I'm extremely grateful for, but they're all labors of love, because the amount of time that goes into writing a large symphonic work. This was about a 40-minute symphonic, piece. It's, a couple of years of a lot of work, and the inspiration behind that is a good question. I think for me, it has a lot to do with the idea of trying to create a place for the electric violin in our musical landscape. And it's something that I think about quite consciously. It's what I do, but and what I've been doing for a long time. I've been playing electric violin since the 1980s, 6-string electric violins. And I've pretty much made some of the very first instruments and was one of the very first people, me and Mark Wood, who was kind of got me started on this in 1981. And we were building a lot of the first instruments together. But nobody was playing it, and besides us. And while we wanted to be, at that point in the 80s, both of us, our goals, our clearly stated goals were to become rock stars. We just wanted to be the first electric rock and roll, violinist who we were both going to be the Jimi Hendrix of the electric violin. That's what our goal was, to try to get, and not just for ourselves. You got to understand, this was more of a a movement that we were spearheading, and I still am an evangelist for this movement, and that is to try to get kids to play air violin instead of air guitar when they're listening to music that they love, and to make a violin, in other words, to make the violin, the electric violin, a real usable, functioning instrument in rock and roll. Because back then it was rock and roll. Now, of course, it's hip hop and all kinds of other stuff. But back in the 70s, 80s, rock reigned supreme, except unless you were on the disco, train. You were sort of one or the other back in that day. But it was a lot of rock and roll. And so, what we really wanted to do is to do what had happened with the guitar, which was it got electrified. Guitar had been around for centuries, but once it became more of a folk instrument, a rock instrument, acoustically and of course electrically, with people like Hendrix and Clapton and everybody putting it on the map, we knew that had to happen with violin, and we wanted to be there making those instruments, designing them and playing them, and creating a new future for string players where their options were not just to play the beautiful classical music that I loved, Sibelius and Prokofiev and things like that, but as much as I loved that, I knew that there was something unsustainable about that. It was anachronistic. It was in a state of arrested development where string playing was taught the same way for the previous 100 years since the early 20th century as it had, been taught. The Russian school of string playing, Joseph Joachim and Leopold Auer, and all of that whole thing that I was a direct descendant of. My teacher in Chicago studied with Leopold Auer, and that was the way violin was taught. But it was not making the violin a useful 21st century, or at that point 20th century, instrument in our popular musical culture. And that's what I was trying to change, and still am.
And I think you're doing a great job with that. I mean, in my experience of knowing you and seeing how well you work with young students, and their eyes just light up seeing that you can play all those cool and hip rock and roll songs on the violin. They're like, wow, and it's just fascinating. Even as a classically trained musician and violinist, it's just amazing to see what you can do when you electrify something and you add strings and you add pedals and the expanse that you can take it to. And I'm definitely excited. When does that next concerto come out?
Well, that concerto, the third one that I'm talking about, actually came out in 2017 and a few years ago. And we premiered it with 4 orchestras. It was never recorded properly, so I don't have a great version of it that I can show the world, which is breaking my heart, because that's, if I had a wish list, that would be the top of it, to be able to get the thing recorded. My second electric violin concerto, which was played with several orchestras, I also don't have an orchestral recording of it. You have to understand, for your audience, needs to understand that to record an orchestra is a big deal, because not only the production of recording it, but you have to pay an orchestra to record. So it involves somebody really investing a lot of money in a recording to do that. So it's not something that I can undertake myself. What I did in my second concerto was I created a reduction of it for string quartet, and I hired the Calder String Quartet. It was a wonderful new music ensemble out of California. I hired them and had them play on my recording. So I have a sort of version of that piece, but it's not the orchestral version. It's a string quartet, an electric violin.
Still having the reduction with a string quartet sounds very interesting, and it sounds like it would bring a whole different life to a piece that you already fell in love with and composed for full orchestra.
Exactly. Well, it was the only way that I could make that music available to anybody. As artists, as creative artists, our sort of directive, it's kind of like our life force, the thing that motivates us is getting our music into people's ears. We want people to hear what we've done. We have a point of view. We have a view of the world that we're trying to share. It's like the music of every period in history, from Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, throughout history. All of those composers are giving us a relic, a sample of what life was like, what the musical life was like in that moment. It's a snapshot of what Vienna was like in 1788, let's say, for Mozart or something. And they're giving us this document from the past. And because music has this incredible ability to speak beyond politics, to speak beyond logic even, and current events, and speak directly to our emotions and just tell us what it feels like to live in this moment, in a way that almost no other art form can. Painting can show us, photography can certainly show us a very realistic picture of what life was like, but music can make us feel in a way that's immediate, direct, visceral, to the gut. And so I think it's very important for every period in history to have composers who are documenting what it feels like to live in this moment. What does it feel like to live in the United States in 2020 musically, as an electric violinist, or whatever. And these are, at least to us who create these things, the reason we're creating them is because it's important for us to share this with people and to go, hey, this is the way I hear it. This is the way I see it. Listen, listen to this is what we're saying, and if nobody's listening, it's kind of disappointing.
What does living a creative life mean to you, and what is creativity to you?
The big question, creativity. I guess most, in terms of creativity, people think of that as sort of a self-expression. Certainly it is. I think it's also important to, you can express yourself in a way that a million other people have expressed themselves in exactly the same way, in a sort of generic, sort of cliche way, because those, cliches are cliches because everybody feels them and they're real, but because they're overused, they become cliches. So while creativity is self-expression, I like to think that to really be creative, you have to have a unique point of view. There has to be something about your vision of the world that is distinctly yours. So that's the first thing, and I think takes some knowing of yourself to know what is your perspective of the world. Picasso has a way that he paints. That's his way of seeing the world, this crazy whatever. That's his vision of the world. It's different from Monet's. So I think musicians, we all have to have our way of hearing the world. But the actual creative process, when you get right down to it, people have asked me, you've written like a symphonic works. How do you start something like that? How do you complete something like that? What is that process? And the thing that it seems like to me, what is boiled down to, somebody once explained to me that the word decision, to decide, is to cut away. Like an incision is to cut in, and a decision is to cut away. And what you're doing when you make a decision is you're eliminating other choices. You're eliminating other possibilities. So in writing a huge piece, what I was telling the students is that what you need to do is just start making tough choices. You need to make a decision. Okay, the piece is going to be this long. It's going to have this instrumentation. It's going to be about this. At least you have something in your mind. I want it to be 3 movements. I want it to be nonstop, no breaks. You start making choices like that. And then you start saying, okay, 3 movements. I want it to be fast, slow, fast, or whatever. That's a choice. Okay, now I've got this. I want it to have a strong melodic motif, or I don't. I want it to be atonal. Those are all choices. And as each time you start making a choice, you're moving down a creative pathway in which other options are, you're starting with this huge world of infinite possibilities. And as you start going, you start making these choices, and your next choice becomes clearer and clearer because there are fewer and fewer options. You're just sort of refining these choices until you end up focusing on exactly what it is that you're creating. And so that creative process, rather than being overwhelmed by that blank canvas in front of you or the blank screen in front of you, on your computer, just start making choices one by one and until it's done.
A lot of people have been working from home or finding other passion projects to do while working from home in 2020. Has the current situation given you time to delve into other projects or, changed your creative process or seen things in another light?
Well, it's certainly given me more time, which, to be honest, I'm incredibly grateful for. Because at my advanced point in my career, I'm 60 years old this year, and it's time is the most precious thing that anybody can give me. Money is nice, but you can always find a way to make money. You can't make time, no matter what you do. And it just, you can only spend it. And so this was kind of a gift of time that I've been trying to put to good use and just holed up in my studio here. It's a very lovely place. I'm grateful to have it. And I've just got barely enough gear to do what I need to do. I got Pro Tools. I got a decent, laptop and get my work done. And it has what I've been focusing on for this whole, pretty much since the pandemic started, since about April, is an educational project. I've been taking I have this book, I don't mean to plug it, but I've got this book that I wrote called Strumbowing, and it's something I've been teaching for years. And it's part of this whole mission statement that I've been talking about of trying to bring string playing into the 21st century. And I realized about 20 years ago that there are a few elements of string playing that are key to advancing us into and actually connecting us to our current music. And I talk about this a lot these days, what our current music is. Rock and roll, hip hop, jazz, film scores, video music, TV, all the sounds, all the music that is currently being produced in our culture, and essentially pop music, right? And connecting strings to that in a meaningful way, I think the real key to that is not treating us the way we've normally been treated, which is as a melodic instrument. Because the association with classical music is so strong and so deep. As soon as you hear a violin playing something, immediately there's an association with European classical music from the 19th century, essentially, 18th, 19th century. It's really hard to get around that unless you're fiddling and playing fiddly music, bluegrass, folk. So there's that, and there's classical, but there's no representation in our real current pop music. The way guitars used to be in rock and roll, not so much in hip hop, but they're there a little bit. Keyboards, electronics, drums, beats, all of the kind of stuff that makes up the sound of today, strings have no part in that. And how do we get them in there? And my gut feeling was that the most important thing was teaching strings how to groove, how to play rhythm, and to start playing strings not as melodic instruments, but as rhythm instruments. Basically treating them as chordal instruments, which they aren't really, unless you put 6 strings on them. And then they get a little bit easier to be treated as chordal instruments because you have actual working bass notes. Like a guitar can really kind of play bass notes for a singer, for instance. If you're accompanying a singer-songwriter or something, you play guitar and you sing, it sounds complete. You have a rhythm instrument that is holding down the bass, is filling in all the harmony, is giving you rhythm, all in one package, right? One strumming package on a guitar. And nobody does that on stringed instruments, but it's completely possible. It just hasn't been done. That's not the tradition. So I'm trying to change that tradition by teaching people how to play chords on strings and how to strum with their bow in a way that is effective, because string players are not taught that way. I'll give you a quick example. I'm going to grab my fiddle here. Hang on one second. So if I were going to say to, and I do this all the time, to a class of string players, okay, play this riff. It goes like this. Da 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 da. Right? Everybody sing it. I got them singing first. Okay, now play it. And they play it like this, like any string player would play it. Right? But if you ask a guitar player to play that, you will never, ever in your life see a guitar player pick up a guitar and go, right? It looks goofy. That's not how you play the guitar. You play the guitar like this. right? I'm strumming with my hand. My hand is going back and forth the same way all the time. Instead of going ba da 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 and just playing the accents, my hand is playing da 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 everything, and I'm muting what I don't want to hear. Simple as that. Every guitar player can do this in their second lesson. Right? It's the easiest thing in the world. So, but it's not hard. Like I always say, if guitar players can do it, how hard could it be? But it's just not the way we're taught. We're not taught to do that because we're not taught how to mute those strings. We're always taught how to make beautiful sounds. We're never taught how to not make sounds, right? So in order to do that, you have to know how to get those muted sounds, and we can do that on a violin. You can mute them like that. So that's how you can do that and keep time and actually groove, because that's way groovier if I go. It's going to groove better than, right? Because of all those little notes. And then you go from this middle of the bow to the bottom where you go in. And, you know, we involve this vertical thing, which also was never taught to me at Juilliard. So it's not that this is impossible. It's not that it's even really hard. It's just different. And it's not the tradition. It's not the way strings are taught. So I'm on a mission to change the way strings are taught, to change the pedagogy of this. And I believe that if you start with the kids, you can change the future. It's going to be... You can help professionals who are, you know, classical string players to try to lose that classical accent and learn how to groove. It's possible, but we're going to change the future by changing kids. So I've been, you know, really focusing on trying to get these ideas into the hands of young players, getting into the hands of teachers who are teaching in classroom schools, you know, string orchestras in public schools. To start, I have a whole, you know, series of orchestra pieces, groove studies that are etudes to teach kids how to do these things, how to ghost, how to keep strumming and things like that. So that's what I've been spending my time on since the pandemic, is a video course, an online video course where I'm teaching this book, and I've started writing a second book called The Rhythm String Player, and I have the whole online course for that already shot and edited and coming out in about a week or two. This is November we're talking now, but this will air, I guess, in January, February, whatever. So hopefully it will be out. It's on Teachable. And so that's what I've been doing. It's a lot of work. I put together the two flagship courses for this are 30-day challenges each. So there's 30 lessons for each course, short little bite-sized lessons. And the idea is you know, what I'm trying to do is to make this so that people can just do this as a warm-up or as a little fun sort of encore at the end of their practice day, do a little 10-minute groove stuff work and incorporate it into your daily practice routine. So I've got these 30 short lessons, but they're very tightly edited, and there's lots of graphics on screen and all that kind of stuff. So I'm doing it all myself, so it's taking forever.
That sounds like quite the undertaking, but very exciting.
Yeah.
And especially for young players, you know, if they're stuck at home and they're missing being able to play with friends and in their school orchestras, and they're looking for ways to expand.
Yeah, I hope so. We'll see. You know, I'm trying to make it, you know, the flagship version and then sort of a condensed, smaller version that will be cheaper and more accessible and things like that. So trying to make it available to everybody on different levels who are interested in this. That's my goal. That's what I see as my mission in life at this point. Who knows when I'm going to be able to get back on the road and play concerts, you know.
It sounds like composing and doing the educational piece is something that's really interesting you right now and your main focus. Do you see that in the months coming forward as being more of what you end up doing just because of the situation we're all in?
Well, who knows, you know, when the classical music world is going to really start gearing back up. The orchestral world is going to be among the last parts of that to probably really get going. So I'm a complete optimist by nature. I wouldn't be able to do what I do if I wasn't. But I'm also a realist, and I'm afraid that my place in the classical world may be tenuous, just because a lot of what I do professionally is play with orchestras as a soloist, playing this John Adams concerto, the Dharma at Big Sur. You see my poster back here. Terry Riley, great American composer, wrote a concerto for me that we premiered with the Nashville Symphony. We recorded with Naxos Records and played it in Carnegie Hall. And, so that's kind of what I'm probably best known for are some of these premieres of electric violin concertos that I've gotten commissioned. And again, that's part of my mission, to get this instrument out into the world. And I think that's going to be a tough road to, it's going to be a while before I'm going to get hired again, frankly. I have a concert coming up in June with the Milwaukee Symphony playing Dharma, but orchestras are very, very cautious right now, the ones that are going to make it through this at all. And what I do is very interesting to me, but it's definitely on the fringes of the classical world and not the first thing that gets booked, so.
Yeah. Speaking from, experience of, seeing you perform and seeing your work and hearing your work, I definitely think there's a place for new music and electric violin. It's just, I think we all as artists have to, I guess we're forced to get a little more out of the box when it comes to pursuing our dreams, especially now that 2020 has happened, getting more creative with how we connect with audiences and how we promote and how we help people connect with music and find music. But it sounds like you're doing a fantastic job. I was wondering, who were your role models growing up? Since obviously you are a role model to many in terms of electric violin and new and contemporary music. You didn't have that as much in your growing up. And I'm wondering who you looked up to as a musician.
It's a good question because, I like to tell people I went to Juilliard hoping to be the next Jascha Heifetz, and I left hoping to be the next Jimi Hendrix. So somewhere in there, my role models shifted to my parents' dismay. But, I guess my role models when I was younger were guitar heroes, after initially it was Milstein and Oistrakh and Heifetz. And then what happened? And you may, you or your audience may be wondering, well, how did this shift happen? And, like I was saying, part of it, even at that age, I realized that, the violin needed to be advanced. And so I started really pursuing this electric violin as a corollary to the electric guitar. But the reason I was doing that is because all my friends were listening to guitar players, and I just wanted to play music that they would get, that they would like, that they would think was cool, because they didn't know what a Sibelius violin concerto was. What the heck is that? And even though they probably would have loved it, it would have been a hard pitch, because it's like in a different language. It's sort of like, it's not as far as like a Shakespearean English, but Shakespeare, they're great plays, and if you modernize them, anybody can understand them. But if you don't, a lot of people are confused by the language, and that's kind of what classical music is to a lot of young people. It's not that they can't enjoy it. It's just, it sounds very old fashioned. So I wanted to speak in my language, the language that my friends speak in, rock and roll. I wanted to play music that they would think rocked. So I started plugging into amps and discovered that when you crank up an electric violin with distortion through a Marshall amp, it kind of levels the playing field. Suddenly everybody goes, oh, this is super cool. And in fact, it blows people's minds because they just don't expect that out of a violin. So you get that shock factor as well. You get the surprise factor. But so my role models were, I was trying to be the next Jimi Hendrix, but I was also, who I was influenced by musically was kind of a lot deeper and more complex than that. I was listening to a lot of John Coltrane back then. when I was at Juilliard. I had jazz friends who really turned me on to Coltrane. I was transcribing giant steps and trying to play it on violin. And just there's something about Coltrane's sound, again, that it just affected me in a way that, was totally visceral. It just was. I would just listen to it, and there was something amazingly, what's the word, spiritual about what he was doing. There was something important about it. And same thing with Miles Davis. Man, he could just, the tune Blue and Green, I spent months trying to imitate every nuance of his sound till I could imitate it. And people could go, oh, wow, and that sounds like Miles, no vibrato, like a tonguing accent with my bow, just try every little detail of it. And so I had a lot of role models, at the same time, still a huge Prokofiev fan. And in my writing, I'm like, things naturally tend to veer towards Prokofiev. I got to be careful, So all of those kind of influences, musical influences, jumping around in my head. And I don't know if that's what you mean by role models, influences, stuff like that. I read a book, I remember, about Bob Marley, right around the time I was just got out of Juilliard, and I was trying to figure out what to do with the violin, the electric violin, and his political message that he was trying to carry his people to freedom, and something about that resonated with me. I was like, I'm going to do that for the violin. I'm going to be, I wanted to be like that. I wanted to be somebody who was carrying a banner for his cause. And, my friend, Mark Wood, who we started making electric violin, used to call me rebel without a brain. Just because I wanted, I was so like that. I wanted to carry this banner, and he was like, it was almost became a joke at one point. But that was kind of a role model for me also. It was not just the musical thing, but the sense of activism, the sense of sort of social activism that somebody's got to do this, and it might as well be me.
You've definitely got a lot of passion for music, for electric violin, for changing the landscape of violin to be more versatile, which is fantastic and just wonderful. Speaking as a violinist, I think it really makes it more colorful in music, and I can't wait to see what else happens in the future, especially as young violinists come up in the world. I was wondering, what's one of the best compliments you've ever received?
The best thing to me is always when a young person gets it and they sort of are grateful for what my help in that. That's the most rewarding thing for me, because really what's important, again, in this sort of mission in my life is this idea that young people are going to take, the baton that I'm trying to pass and run with it further than I ever could. So, for instance, I really want violin, electric 6-string violin, by the way, which I really think is a significantly important instrument because it can be used as a rhythm instrument. It can function differently, so it's really a kind of a different animal. And I'm hoping that there will be young people in the hip hop community, in the real grassroots people who are making music in their bedrooms, and young producers going from that level up to the producers who are making hit records and who are producing big rappers and big singers and pop singers, that they will discover the violin, this electric violin, and use it in an authentic way in their music, in a way that I never could, because it's impossible for me to change my background, my upbringing, full of classical music, full of all of this stuff, and being a white person of my age and my years that I grew up in the 70s and 80s, I have a host of influences that I'm happy for, but I can't lose. But young people who may have never heard a classical violin, who have never heard the Tchaikovsky concerto, they've heard of Bach and Beethoven, they've heard the names, but they're just not familiar with the repertoire, don't have a preconception of what a violin is supposed to really sound like. may never have heard one in person and somehow picks up one of these instruments because maybe of something I did or something that a student has done. And maybe this is 10 years from now and starts to explore in an authentic way, strumming, using this strumming idea that they've seen people do because maybe it's infiltrated down into the younger generation and starts producing real authentic music on this instrument that I would never be able to do because I'm not part of that culture. And so that's what I'm hoping. That's my dream, that I will live to see young producers, hip hop producers, incorporating young, hopefully people of color playing these instruments and doing authentic, vibrant, contemporary, popular music with them in a way that hasn't happened since the 18th and 19th century, where violin was an important part of the pop music of the day.
I think that would be absolutely wonderful. I know there are some indie bands and rock bands who have violinists, or some of my friends are like play cello and they electrify their cello and they play in bands, but I haven't seen too much of people just going out, like you said, and creating something more authentic as yet. But I definitely have hope that as we're definitely on their way. People are expanding and getting more creative every day with music, which I've noticed is fantastic. And especially nowadays, we used to all have a little more time to our creative pursuits. I was also wondering, what is something you wish you had known when you first started out in your field?
Very bad networker in the early days. And, coming up in the 80s, really my professional life started in the 80s. There was no internet. Internet was 20 years away, really, practically. And, so it was not easy to network. And I just wasn't good at it. And holy cow, if, that would have helped my career if I'd have somebody told me, just go hang out and meet people and do that kind of stuff. I did plenty. I mean, I spent years in the rock clubs and stuff, but it wasn't in the right places at the right times and, stuff like that. So spinning my wheels for a lot of time. My whole 20s, I spent my entire 20s playing in rock bands in New York City, playing in the clubs, getting absolutely nowhere. And holy cow, that's 10 really important years of your life. If I had come out of those years with, I was trying to get a record deal back then, that was the only way to get anywhere. And I never got one. And, if I could have come out of that with a couple of records and, that would have been very helpful to my life, but that didn't happen. I refer to those 10 years now as wandering in the desert, like musically, because what I was doing was making no money. I was, practically literally starving. But I remember times when I was literally going through the couch cushions to get change to pay the 60-cent toll to get from Yonkers to Manhattan. So there were some very, very, thin days back then. Anyway.
Tell me about a time when you felt most alive or happy with your music, like one of your favorite memories.
Favorite memories, being in Turtle Island was a wonderful experience for me. It was my first real professional gig. It was kind of my big break. And we went to Brazil. The first time we went to Brazil, I think it was in 95, 94. I had been a real fan of Brazilian music because my dad was a big jazz fan back in the early days when bossa nova first hit in the 60s. And my dad was way into that. So I grew up listening to a lot of great Brazilian music, João Gilberto, and of course all of the Jobim tunes and stuff like that. And So when I got down there, I was just a Brazilophile. I loved the music, and any any chance that I had, I would jam with some of the Brazilian musicians down there, which we had wonderful opportunities to do, and got introduced to this kind of music called choro, which they have down there, choros and chorinhos, which are just so much fun, and all these great Brazilian musicians would just like take out a book and put it on the piano, and we'd all gather around and we'd play this great music. And those are some of my fondest memories, being on the road. That was a wonderful time.
Before we go, I wanted to mention the recipe that you shared, matzo brie, which sounds amazing. And I want to go get the ingredients and make it pretty much immediately. I'm like, yes, please. I was wondering if you want to share a little bit about why it's so meaningful to you.
Very simple. Well, matzo brie is sort of super simple. It's just a pancake made out of matzah. And matzah, for those who may not be familiar with it, is the Jewish bread of affliction. And it only you can only buy it during Passover season, which is around Easter time. And they're just these flat crackers, basically, which is just, they're like saltines. There's just flour and water. There's nothing to them. And is a Jewish recipe to make like a pancake out of them, and all you do is you break them up and you soak them a little bit in water, and you mix them with a couple beaten eggs, and you fry it in oil, and it kind of makes a flat pancake, and then you put sugar all over on top of it, and it's just kind of a traditional thing that I grew up with, that we would have pretty much every year when we could get matzah, and we all loved it because it was crispy. And, it's greasy, crispy. It's sort of like a funnel cake, a Jewish funnel cake, zero nutritional value, and 100% fun and deliciousness. So I started making them for my kids, to show them, something I grew up with. But as you can see, that email I sent to my mom, I was making it and it wasn't coming out the same. I was like, what am I doing wrong here? So I just wrote her. I was like, it's that. So that email was her response.
It sounds very tasty. Is it one of your favorite foods?
It's a guilty pleasure. It's it's nothing too fancy, nothing too wonderful, but I just thought it's sort of a sentimental thing, and I thought my mom's her recipe. I used to before her mother, my nana, my grandmother, when she was older, I went to her and I said, Nana, I want to get you to tell me a bunch of these recipes so I can write them down, because we don't have them written down anywhere. And she had all things like her chicken soup and her kreplach, which are these sort of dumplings, Jewish dumplings, and all these wonderful things that she would make, and stuffed cabbage and stuff like that. And so she would tell me the recipes, but the recipes were like, break an egg, fill half the egg with water, and take 3 of those, and take a pan and fill the pan till it's a half an inch, like, well, how big of a pan? She was like, a frying pan. So her recipes were completely, personal to the kitchen utensils that she had. So my mom's response was kind of similar to that. And it was like, soak it for a minute under the water. And, there was nothing terribly precise about it. It was very, an oral tradition in more than one way. 2 meanings.
Made with a labor of love.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on Creative Piecemeal, a creative arts podcast. And we look forward to hearing from you in the future. Can you tell us again the names of your string books so that our listeners can look them up?
Thank you. It's called The Strumbowing Method. And you can find it at strumbowing.com. And everything Strumbowing is up there. The new courses will be up there. The new book, when it comes out next year, will be up there. And strumbowing.com. You can find me at tracysilverman.com. And I'm on all the socials. Please friend me and say hi.
Excellent. Well, that will do us for today's episode. Thank you, and stay tuned. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Like the show? Have a question? Stop by the Facebook and Instagram pages. Links are in the show notes, or search for Creative Piecemeal Podcast on social media and click follow for all the latest.